Rule 36 is a general tip about how to organize an argumentative essay. Rule 36 is saying that the overall form of your argument, your basic argument that has your main premises in support of the conclusion, this can be adapted into an outline for an argumentative essay. So an example of this is the argument, many solar systems are now being discovered beyond our own. Many of them are likely to include Earth-like planets. Many Earth-like planets are likely to have life. Therefore, there is probably life on other planets. If you were trying to argue in this way for that conclusion, therefore there is probably life on other planets, it would make sense to include a separate section or chapter for each of those main premises. Because each of those things is something that could be controversial or may not be obvious to someone reading the essay, and so you would need to defend them with evidence. So let's take, for example, the first premise. Many solar systems are now being discovered beyond our own. That might not be common knowledge to people, and even if they have some awareness of it, how many is many? So you'd want to give a lot of evidence to support that claim. And so too for each of premises 2 and 3. So this is not necessarily what you're always going to be doing when writing an argumentative essay, but it should be your first thought, is if you're going to structure it around defending the main claims of your argument, the main premises, because that will help you support the argument as a whole. So here's an example. Let's take a look at that first premise. Many solar systems are being discovered beyond our own. So here's an example of evidence you could give in support of that premise. As of April 22nd, 2020, the Paris Observatory's Extrasolar Planets Encyclopedia lists 4,251 known planets of other stars. That's a good piece of evidence in support of the premise. Now, exactly how long it will take to present the evidence, explain it, how many pieces of evidence you need, that will vary based on the case. So sometimes it will not take very long at all, maybe a paragraph to prove a premise. Other times it might take many paragraphs or pages. So the general thing is to just make each section as long as you need for logical or evidentiary purposes. And another thing to consider is that some premises from the additional arguments may themselves need defending. So for example, if someone is not familiar with exoplanets, they may wonder, well, what evidence is there for exoplanets? Why is it even believed? Or how can we know that exoplanets exist in other solar systems because they cannot be directly observed? They're too far away. That's a really interesting question that you may want to go into the evidentiary basis for this claim. As a general rule, a premise needs defending either if it's controversial or if it might be rejected by uninformed readers. So something you can not defend would be something that is widely believed or is something that is defended by experts. But in the case that something is defended by experts and is not widely known, it still may be to your advantage to defend it in your argument. Rule 37 is about how to raise and detail objections and to face or confront them. So the most common mistake you want to avoid is not giving enough attention to developing or detailing an objection. It's common, it's good to raise an objection even briefly, but it's not ideal to just briefly state it maybe in a single sentence or part of a sentence and then focus all on the reply. Instead, you want to spend time patiently developing the objection, perhaps in one or more paragraphs, so that its assumptions and logical structure are clear. The main reason why you're doing this is both so that you can understand the objection, and secondly, so that you can persuade people who might believe it. If someone believes the objection and not your argument, and you just briefly state the objection before dismissing it, they're not likely to take your dismissal very sympathetically. But if you show great patience and care in making the objection as clear and even as strong as possible, it's more effective at winning over people who might be doubting your argument. There's two main strategies for responding to an objection. One is to say the objection fails because it has a false premise or one or more false premises. And then a second way an objection can fail is if it's logically flawed. So the argument is weak or invalid, and so even if the premises were true, they would not prove the conclusion of the objection. So you're going to choose one of those two strategies in responding to the objection. So here's a sample problem involving an objection that we would want to detail and then respond to. The world has no shortage of urgent problems. It's unconscionable for people like Elon Musk to spend millions of dollars on frivolous projects like launching his car into space to show off his company's latest rocket. Even his broader aim of exploring Mars pales in comparison to the importance of tackling problems here on Earth. Musk and his supporters will surely object that we need to do fun and exciting things too. But we can worry about fun when children aren't dying of malaria, famine, and errant bombs. So the objection in this argument is Musk and his supporters will surely object that we need to do fun and exciting things too. You'll notice it only occupies one part of one sentence. There's two things about this objection. One, it's brief. Two, it's a little bit unfair or uncharitable. It makes it just sound that the idea of spending money on something else than preventing disease or famine or preventing war, to make it sound like it's just totally frivolous and has no real value. So to detail and strengthen the objection, you might say something like, Musk and his supporters may object that there are other valuable things that can be done than fighting malaria, famine, or trying to reduce casualties from warfare. And then you would want to give some examples of those other uses, valuable uses of money. It could include things like the space exploration, but think of all the ways people spend money that don't relate directly to survival. There's entertainment, you could think of that as fun and exciting, but there's other things too, right? Like there's art, there's literature, there's religion. People give money to all kinds of causes other than the one cited at the end, saving people from disease, famine, and warfare. So you would want to mention all of that to make that objection stronger. And then as far as meeting or responding to the objection, probably the most effective strategy is to acknowledge that, look, things other than preventing disasters or other loss of life are valuable, but if you want to do a cost-benefit analysis, what's the best way you can spend your resources? What's the most bang for your buck? That even though you'd be giving up some enjoyment, some excitement, or even some fulfillment, or even some knowledge from spending on those other projects, you'd be saving lives, which are even more valuable. Something like to that effect would be a better way of dealing with the objection than in this argument. Rule 38 is about improving your argumentative essay by deliberately seeking feedback and incorporating it into the essay. So there's a few kinds of problems that you might be able to improve using feedback. So these are three common types of problems. One, a lack of clarity of expression. This one is easy to fall into because if you're writing for just yourself as your main audience, if you haven't heard back from any other audience, there are things that are going to make sense to you. There are things that are going to seem obvious to you which will not make sense or which will not seem obvious to another audience. Therefore, you need to try to get feedback either from friends, family members, colleagues, or just other people that you can have contact with. That's a great and invaluable aid. So they'll point out sentences or whole sections which either they just don't understand or which they don't agree with. And maybe you could get ideas from them on how to make it more compelling and clear. A second type of problem is a premise that needs defending. So it might be clear what exactly you're saying, but it's just not convincing to people. And so that's something that you would want to get feedback on as well. And thirdly, there could be whole objections that you're just missing. Someone might disagree with your argument for a reason you had never considered, never brought up. And so it's great to be able to pick people's brains for reasons why they disagree with you, even though they've read your whole argumentative essay. So a general tip when looking at this idea of feedback is to regard your essay not as a finished product that you just write in a single step, but rather as a process, something you're going to work on over time. And so you can incorporate the cycle of feedback and improvement, or maybe multiple cycles of that, into the process. You could think of the essay as something that is grown or trained or developed over time, rather than just something you produce all in one go. Rule 39 is about having modesty in your argumentative essay. Here we're talking about intellectual modesty, what's often called intellectual humility. This means you're not being overly proud or arrogant in terms of your claims to knowledge or your claims to how much you've justified something. There's two main types of intellectual humility that are relevant to this. The first is modesty in the scope of your conclusion. So here's an example of a conclusion that is unreasonable on the face of it just because it's too broad in its scope. All Muslims support terrorism. Even if it's true that some Muslims support terrorism, it's almost certainly false that all of them do, just because that claim has such a wide scope. So you want to consider, even if you've proven something, that there can be a mismatch between what you've actually proven and the scope of your claim or the scope of your conclusion. A second type of intellectual humility is modesty in the degree of certainty of the conclusion. So here's an example of a conclusion with exaggerated certainty. Banning immigration is guaranteed to reduce unemployment. Perhaps you've given evidence to support the claim that an immigration ban would reduce unemployment. However, because you're dealing with the economy, which is a super complex system, has many different causal factors affecting it all at once, that tends to go along with degrees of certainty. So it would be more reasonable to argue for a conclusion that banning immigration will probably reduce unemployment, or will reduce unemployment, what economists call ceteris paribus, holding other things equal.